If I was asked which game most personified the idea of freedom, I'd say Breath of the Wild, but in terms of the moment-to-moment experience, it's without a doubt the Gravity Rush series. Brought to you by the director behind Silent Hill, Keiichiro Toyama. No, I'm not joking, the guy who directed this... directed this. It may be a bit jarring, but it only makes sense. I never met anyone who only had one hobby or only liked one genre of game. The following video will be spoiling a bunch of Gravity Rush 2 as well as the original, so leave now if you're a coward who cares about that kind of stuff. I mainly wanted to talk about the second game because frankly, I think it's easily the better of the two. I will talk about the first Gravity Rush here and there, but only in regards to the concept development and how the sequel expands upon its gameplay. In this comfy little game, you play as Kat, a friendly homeless girl who can control gravity. When designing her, senior artist Yoshiyami Yamaguchi said he wanted her to feel like an exotic outsider with a girl next door personality. They pulled this off incredibly well. Her outfit and her red eyes set her apart from the rest of the cast. Even her skin tone won't quite match up with any NPCs, at least until we reach one particular area late into the second game. Much of the animation behind Kat is worthy of applause. When flying through the air, Kat's fall animation is physics-based, which goes a long way to make sure watching her fly never gets old. Otherwise, she has an upbeat, earnest way of carrying herself and even a surprising amount of confidence that comes through her animation. The scarf is a great touch too, doubling as both a dynamic part of her design and as a compass for which way is down. As a protagonist, it's impossible not to root for her. She's grounded enough for anyone to get where she's coming from, and while that may lead to some of her dialogue being predictable, she also has moments where her perspective and attitude perfectly matches the goals and themes of the game. I couldn't imagine a more fitting protagonist. The movement is the main draw of the game. You are literally free to go in any direction you choose at any time. The world is your playground and it's exhilarating. I find so much joy just flying through the city, collecting gems, taking silly side missions, and taking in the gorgeous view. It's a comfy experience heightened by an orchestral jazzy soundtrack which lends to the sense of scope and whimsy. Without a doubt, this is one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard. Coincidentally, the soundtrack is done by one of the composers behind One Piece's soundtrack, and you know, I like One Piece. Do you like One Piece? I like One Piece. I've played games with flying mechanics before, but none of them manage to catch that sense of flight quite the same way, either because you're controlling a vehicle or because you'd break the game if you had too much freedom. Gravity Rush doesn't compromise and builds the game around your complete autonomy. The only limitation is the gravity gauge. It does feel like a drag waiting for it to recover while traveling, but it works well as a punishment for players not paying attention during missions or combat. Kat also has some supplementary tricks that make traversing smooth. Cat Slide is a great way for quickly changing your sense of gravity or as a transition from flying. The Flip is great for quick readjustments while doubling as a dodge. There's more to her moveset that I'll talk about later, but those are the basics. One decision that'll probably turn some people off is the use of the gyroscope. If you tilt or move the controller, the camera will move too. It's definitely understandable if you don't want such a sensitive camera, but I find it gives a more natural feeling to the flight. The cities that act as the overworld catch a sense of scope without being overwhelming. They're also incredibly beautiful, and the team's admitted inspiration from Jean Giraud's Mobius is clear. Their layouts are generally pretty memorable. I can roughly make out the map of each area and where I am inside of it by taking a quick look around. Each city has a distinct look to it, not just in architecture and music, but also in the skybox changing colors to suit the mood of each city. While they do run the risk of feeling too small, it's mitigated by the verticality of the cities. Not to mention the crowded streets that are packed with life ready to be torn to shreds by the physics engine. Sometimes the textures will take a second to load if you suddenly stop after going fast, but it's easy to overlook considering there are no load screens anywhere in the overworld. That's just great. Naturally, there's a plethora of side missions where Cat interacts with the locals. Side missions range from short distractions to genuinely charming. You might get some cute dialogue, a fun new character, and maybe a decent mission. But I have to talk about this stupid f***ing dog. This little bastard is impossible to catch without luck. I tried it slow, but that doesn't work. You gotta muscle through and force until you get lucky. I spent like 3 minutes just trying to walk up to him and press circle, and it never worked. It never worked. But seriously, the side missions are a nice addition to the game. I like them. The only glaring weakness of the overworld is the lack of secrets to discover. Or at least I thought so until I checked the menu and it turns out I only collected 1% of the collectibles at over 37 hours of play. I thought it was just some costumes hidden behind side missions and some charms, but no. 6 camera albums to fill out, more manhole covers than are honestly necessary, a bunch of hidden treasure chests with decorations for Cat's sewer home, and oh, I'll get back to that. When you're not doing tasks around the city or fighting giant monsters, the game goes to some outer areas not part of the overworld. These areas are beautiful in their own way while feeling really alien, even compared to the flying cities. In them, Cat has to follow a trail of tablets that give her objectives. Sometimes it's defeating enemies within a time limit, or getting through an area without shifting. Some of the best gameplay segments are in these locations, probably because they could be so tightly designed around the objectives. You can revisit most of these places, but sadly, there's not much left to do. It's a darn shame. They would have made for a great place for more challenge missions, or for more secrets to find. Combat and movement both see a big improvement from the first Gravity Rush. Combat in Gravity Rush is mainly an exercise of positioning and aiming, which is great because it centers around the wonderful movement mechanics. Combat was too repetitive in the first game because the increasing health bars of the enemies only served to prolong the fights, and Cat wasn't equipped with many options. Gravity Rush 2's improvements begin with the stasis field. It's faster and easier to use, making for a reliable long-range option. Although scrounging for boxes to throw reminds me of this other game. The most notable change is Cat's new gravity styles. Lunar form makes Cat floaty. She falls slower and her jumps become much stronger. Her melee attacks also get a tracking function, good for dealing with fast enemies, and her stasis field will do less damage but will stun enemies. Jupiter is a heavy form that makes Cat fall faster, boosts her melee attacks, and makes her an absolute tank.
You think you're gonna go out there and save the world without Thunder Thighs?
Its stasis ability also forms all the rubble you pick up into a Katamari ball, which is just delightful. Switching between styles is done by swiping the touchpad. While it took a bit of time getting used to because so few games use that button, it eventually became so smooth and natural. I found myself cycling between all 3 styles seamlessly during both travel and combat. They all have clear strengths and weaknesses. Lunar is good for gaining height and deceleration, while Jupiter is the exact opposite. Cat's normal mode module might be less flashy, but it offers the most control and it's never made obsolete by the other 2. Movement in Gravity Rush was always a joy, but with these improvements it's all the sweeter. However, I feel the combat hasn't found a truly comfortable balance yet. It's no longer a slog, and at its best it's great, but it's not exceptional. I actually have something of a split perspective on this because I see 2 opposite ways this series could stand to improve. On one hand, if it moved away from the combat and focused more on the flying, I'd be happy. They shouldn't remove it completely. The combat feeds into the superhero comic book sad AM feel, and because it's already so developed, it's probably here to stay. On the other hand, if they take a few risks, they might just make a splendid action game. Sometimes, the combat will feel subpar because they don't have to work very hard. Killing enemies with the gravity kick is a great way to challenge players on positioning, and some bosses make great exercises for this, but beyond that there's not much depth. When left to my own devices, I tend to just scrounge for boxes to throw with stasis, and to take my time with larger enemies because of how passive the AI tends to be. The super moves work well for what they are. All three are powerful but distinct. Panther mode, however, leaves something to be desired. It can be fun to see Cat tear through enemies with ease, but as a player, all I really have to do is mash X. I think I prefer if Panther mode just powered up Cat's normal moveset and maybe gave her some more defense. That way, the core gameplay is still highlighted and not erased as it is. I think I'd have more fun that way. Bosses are a mixed bag. Some play to the strengths of the flight in a solid, straightforward way. Others are great set pieces that provide a decent challenge. But there's a distinct group that stands out as bad to me. The humanoid bosses are pretty jank for the most part. In particular, I'm talking about Unica, Permit, and the Angel Sisters. While their agility and small size does test your skills fairly enough, and their movesets are well put together, the act of actually hitting them is where the jank comes in. There's no clear tell for when they're vulnerable or when they'll go into an infinite block mode. As a result, I have to hope I get lucky, and if I'm not, I have to back out and try again. It's a shame because these 4 bosses are major characters and their encounters were memorable for unpleasant reasons. Nightingale and Electricity dodge this issue because they have certain auras that'll tell you when their guard is up and when it's safe to hit them. Electricity herself might be my favorite boss in the game. Her clones can disorient you in a deliberate and fair way. Stasis can also be used to block her attacks, leading to a risk-reward setup. Do you throw your boxes at her for more damage, or keep them for defense? Also, she just looks really cool spread it out across the sky. I've been fairly negative on the combat. You might not think it's great. Well, not very great was my impression until I started playing time missions. A challenge of how fast I can kill enemies and how high a score I can get is far more engaging than what's typically given. I wasn't competing against slow enemies that can't touch a character as agile as Cat anymore. I was competing against myself. How fast could I position myself? Which style would be best at what time? Sadly, there's only 3 time limit battles in the whole game. These 3 missions might be the most satisfying combat experiences in Gravity Rush 2, and I want more! They even brought a boss into the 3rd one. That's pretty cool. I wish there was a scoring system for all the bosses. How awesome would it be if Nightingale was in one of these challenges? Come on, you could have done it. The reason I'm so keen on a scoring or ranking system is because Gravity Rush 2 has one of the most addictive control schemes of any game I've ever played, and I'd love to have more reasons to explore it and master it. Sometimes the game will improve combat with interesting mission structures. It doesn't happen as often as I'd like, but I can list enough great examples to praise the game anyway. The Raven side story did this especially well with a mission of managing territory and having to find objects in the overworld while being chased by 2 invincible bosses. I'd love to see as many missions like this as possible in the next game. Speaking of Raven...
All hail Shadow! Heroes rise again! Obliterating everything that's not your friend!
As much as I initially wanted to see combat fade into the background, Gravity Rush is just a skip and a hop away from being a decent stylish action game on top of an open world platformer. Some of the elements are there, style switching, a scoring system, a diverse set of moves. If they tweak the special moves in Panther mode to fit smoothly into the base moveset, it just might happen. Sadly, it's not there yet. Don't get me wrong, I love the combat in this game. The only reason I'm so critical of it is because I spent so much time with it. And if I spent a whole lot of time with it, I obviously love it a whole lot. If I could make a couple suggestions for Gravity Rush 3, I'd want to replace Cat's Falling Kick, which is her only melee combo, with an attack that can scoop up smaller enemies into stasis. Create a bit of synergy between her abilities. Second would be adding a scoring system. I understand that being told how bad you did on a first playthrough can bring down the comfortable atmosphere of the game, but I'd love to see more time missions at least. Maybe even add a scoring system when replaying story missions. That way both groups of casual and hardcore players can get what they want. Is it weird that I want Gravity Rush to be more like Devil May Cry? Nah. It's fine. Although it's probably asking too much to have even better combat when looking back. They really squeezed out so much from the foundation of the first game, going from barely serviceable repetition to a neat action game. That's pretty impressive. Despite my feelings, it's probably best to stick with the formula they have. It'd be a shame if the series ended up leaning too much on its action at the expense of the movement, which is what Gravity Rush does uniquely well. The level up and talisman menus feel like a shallow inclusion. It's not as if they hinder the experience, but I think it's a clear example of the RPG progression meme popping up where it's not really needed. It does give a use for the collectible gems, but I think I would prefer that the gems were currency to buy costumes for Kat or accessories for her sewer home. Before I move on to the story, I want to talk briefly about the online features, or lack thereof. Unfortunately, only a year after release, the Gravity Rush 2 online servers were shut off, not only killing the community, but locking certain collectibles away from latecomers like myself. It feels bad not getting to experience the online because, from what I could find, the features looked great. Racing the ghosts of other players, seeing what neat pictures could be taken, competing for scores on challenge missions, may have perfectly fed my craving for a scoring system. On top of that, the developer, Japan Studio, was liquefied and merged with other developers, killing most hopes for a sequel. Throughout this video, I talked as if there might be a third Gravity Rush, but that was only to talk about what I think is hypothetically missing. While there may be no future for Gravity Rush, I consider myself lucky to have gotten to play it in the first place. God bless all the people who worked on it. They did a fine job. One of the most notable things about Gravity Rush's presentation is that the characters don't speak Japanese. At first I thought they were speaking French, but that's not right either. The characters speak a constructed language that doesn't exist in reality. You may be tempted to draw comparisons to something like the Zelda series, where characters speak gibberish. However, there's never any pretense that what their characters are speaking is anything but gibberish. That's not the case here. They went as far as making a fake alphabet and even using it in some of the music. The intent behind this was supposedly due to director Toriyama's observation that Japanese dubs of French films felt natural. If this is true, this would fit perfectly with Kat being made to feel like an outsider. When it comes to foreign games and media in general, most people default to subtitles out of necessity, because they can't understand the other language and there's no decent dub that satisfies them. But in Gravity Rush, it's a deliberate choice and I think it paid off. As a fan of Japanese games and anime, I was already used to subtitles. There's something even familiar about it. I like to think Toriyama feels similar in regards to the French films and books he seems to like so much. Everyone playing Gravity Rush, no matter where they come from, will share a similar experience seeing something foreign to them. It's kind of beautiful how an artificial culture barrier can actually erase a culture barrier between people who love media from cultures not their own. As I alluded to earlier, the impression I get from Gravity Rush's story is that it's trying to emulate a serialized comic book or Saturday morning cartoon. And it executes this perfectly. It's an episodic, lighthearted adventure where a ragtag group beats the bad guy and saves the world. The silly low-stakes side quests can even be seen as filler episodes, where the cast is fleshed out and given more cute interactions. Because Gravity Rush pulls this off perfectly, participating in the story feels so incredibly comfy. The lighthearted fun of the story and the freedom inherent in the gameplay is contrasted by the moments the game takes away that freedom. My favorite examples are episode 12 where Kat first acquires Jupiter and can't change out of it, forcing the player to barrel through a cramped space learning how to use the new, clunkier form. The puzzles in episode 23 where Kat has no power and must use mechanisms to traverse. The final boss who... And my favorite example, episode 22, Castle of Sand, where Kat is wiped of her memory and has to spend God knows how many days locked in the palace with access to only 2 rooms and a hallway. Revisiting this section felt so surreal because of you know what. The time slips away, you run out of things to do, and you just want to go outside. In my first playthrough, I tried interacting with everything and everyone I possibly could, wondering if that would help end this boring nightmare sooner. I love this mode for how much it makes me appreciate and miss the ability to fly, to explore the world and feel alive. I understand some people don't think games should be boring at any point, at least if they're not short, artsy indie games. However, this kind of experience is interesting, or even fun to me in its own way. If a game could make me feel closer to a character as I play as them in a way that contributes to the narrative themes, I can only see that as a worthy inclusion, especially in a game as story-heavy as Gravity Rush. Ultimately, Gravity Rush does want to impart a sense of freedom, but it's no Breath of the Wild. The story is linear, you're given very few choices and they're not that meaningful in the grand scheme. But there's a reason the campaign is called Cat's Fate. There's a reason one of the villains wants to freeze time and place, and another tries to tempt you with immortality. It's almost cruel how we always place the future on a pedestal, because we won't always get to be a part of it. There's so many things we can't control. Our circumstances, our family, other people, and our own mortality. The first game had the most effective metaphor for that last one. A floating city that's slowly falling closer and closer to a black hole hiding beneath it. A tragedy just out of sight, but close enough that you can always bend over the railing and take a look. We are temporary and obsessing over the end won't do us any good. The time that we exist is what matters most. Even if the choices we can make are insignificant from a larger perspective, we can live life our own way in a million different ways. Despite this morbid theming, Gravity Rush is still a story about a young, superpowered teen beating the bad guy and saving the city. The lighthearted attitude still pulses through the overwhelming majority of the experience. It's comforting because it doesn't let that grim inevitability stop it from indulging in life's simpler pleasures. I think that's an attitude everyone can benefit from.